Tonight, we travel back into the quiet corners of history, into the frozen streets of 19th century Russia, into candlelit rooms, snow-covered prisons, and the troubled mind of one of history's greatest writers. A man who stared deeply into suffering and found something terrifying and strangely beautiful looking back at him. His name was Fyodor Dostoevsky. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe if these slow philosophical stories help you relax, think deeply, or drift into sleep. And as always, let me know in the comments which philosopher, writer, or historical figure you'd like us to explore next. Now, dim the lights, settle into your pillow, and let the world grow quiet around you. Our story begins in Moscow, where church bells echoed through snowy streets, and a sickly young boy first learned that suffering was everywhere. Moscow, 1821. Winter wrapped the city in silence. Snow gathered on rooftops beside the golden domes of Orthodox churches, while horse carriages creaked slowly through narrow, frozen streets. Inside a small apartment near the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, a child named Fyodor Dostoevsky sat quietly beside a window, watching the snow fall from the pale Russian sky. His father was a military doctor, a stern man, demanding, quick-tempered, the kind of father whose footsteps alone could silence an entire room. Outside the hospital walls, suffering was everywhere. Peasants arrived starving. Children coughed blood into frozen cloth. The poor wandered through Moscow wrapped in torn coats and exhaustion. Young Fyodor saw all of it, and unlike most children, he could not look away. At night, while candlelight flickered against the walls, his mother read him stories from the Bible, stories of pain, sacrifice, mercy, forgiveness. These ideas settled deeply into the boy's mind, because Dostoevsky was not merely sensitive, he was haunted. Even as a child, he seemed painfully aware of death, of loneliness, of the strange sadness hidden inside ordinary life. While other boys played in the streets, Fyodor often remained indoors reading quietly beside dim candlelight. He devoured books obsessively: Pushkin, Gogol, ancient scripture, dark romantic poetry. Stories became more than entertainment to him. They became escape, a way to understand the chaos of the human soul. But life inside the Dostoevsky household was not peaceful. His father ruled the family with cold discipline. Arguments echoed through the apartment walls. Fear lived quietly in the corners of every room. And then, tragedy arrived. When Fyodor was only 16 years old, his mother died from tuberculosis. The warmth of the household disappeared overnight. Silence took its place. Soon after, his father sent him away to a military engineering academy in St. Petersburg. The journey north felt less like opportunity and more like exile. St. Petersburg was cold in a different way, not merely in weather, but in spirit. The city rose from fog and frozen rivers like a dream built from stone and loneliness. Here, surrounded by rigid military discipline and mathematical studies he hated, Dostoevsky became increasingly isolated. The other students saw him as strange, quiet, intense. He walked alone for hours through snowy streets while pale gas lamps flickered in the winter darkness. And somewhere inside that loneliness, the future writer began to awaken. He started filling notebooks with thoughts about suffering, human cruelty, and the desperate need for meaning in a painful world. But another shadow was approaching him, one that would alter his life forever, the shadow of death itself. And unlike the stories he read as a child, this one would be very real. The young intellectual who wandered through St. Petersburg's frozen streets had spent years searching for meaning in books. But now, history itself was about to seize him by the throat. Russia in the 1840s was a nervous empire. Beneath the glittering palaces and military parades, fear quietly ruled the country. The Tsar, Nicholas I, believed dangerous ideas could spread like disease. Writers were watched, newspapers censored, universities monitored. Even private conversations carried risk. And yet, among young intellectuals, forbidden ideas continued to circulate through candlelit apartments and whispered discussions deep into the night. Dostoevsky, emotional and restless by nature, was drawn toward these gatherings almost inevitably. He joined a small discussion group known as the Petrashevsky Circle. There were no bombs, no armies, no grand revolutionary plans. Mostly they talked about freedom, justice, human dignity. They read banned books aloud while cigarette smoke drifted lazily across the room. To Dostoevsky, these meetings felt alive in a way military academies never had. For the first time, he felt surrounded by people asking the same painful questions that haunted him since childhood. Why was suffering everywhere? Why did power crush the weak so easily? Could society itself be changed? But the Russian state saw things differently. To the authorities, ideas themselves were dangerous. And one cold spring night in 1849, the police came. Dostoevsky was arrested without warning and taken to the Peter and Paul fortress, a grim prison looming beside the Neva River. Inside his tiny stone cell, time seemed to dissolve. Days passed in silence. Weeks blurred together. He had almost no contact with the outside world, no certainty about his future. Only the slow, suffocating pressure of fear. Sometimes he paced endlessly across the narrow floor. Sometimes he stared for hours through the small prison window at the pale northern sky. And in that silence, death slowly became real to him. Months later, the prisoners were suddenly awakened before dawn and ordered into carriages. Snow covered the streets of St. Petersburg as soldiers escorted them toward a public square. The air was painfully cold. Crowds gathered quietly. The prisoners were dressed in white burial shirts. Death sentences were read aloud one by one. Dostoevsky listened in stunned silence as his own execution was announced. Nearby, soldiers prepared their rifles. Wooden execution posts stood waiting in the snow. 3 prisoners at a time were tied to them. The first group stepped forward. Dostoevsky believed completely that within minutes he too would be dead. And strangely, in those final moments, life itself suddenly became beautiful, the sunlight reflecting off the snow, the sound of wind moving through the square, the faces of strangers in the crowd. Every tiny detail burned itself into his memory with unbearable intensity. Later, he would say that a human being can live an entire lifetime inside a single minute before death. Then, just as the rifles were about to fire, a messenger arrived on horseback. The execution had been cancelled. The Tsar had staged the entire event as psychological punishment. Instead of death, Dostoevsky would be sent to a Siberian prison camp. Some prisoners collapsed instantly from shock. One reportedly lost his sanity forever. And Dostoevsky walked away transformed. The young dreamer who entered that square no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had stared directly into death itself and survived. Soon afterward, chained beside hardened criminals and murderers, he began the long, frozen journey eastward into Siberia. A journey that would break him, reshape him, and ultimately give birth to the writer the world would one day remember. The journey into Siberia seemed endless. Day after day, the prison convoy moved slowly through frozen forests and empty white landscapes beneath a pale winter sky. Iron chains rubbed against skin already numbed by cold. The prisoners slept in filthy barracks, crowded together beneath the smell of sweat, smoke, and sickness. And somewhere along that brutal road, Dostoevsky began to encounter a side of humanity he had never truly understood before. The men beside him were not philosophers. They were thieves, murderers, peasants, violent men hardened by suffering and survival. At first, he feared them. Their faces looked carved from exhaustion and cruelty. Their tempers exploded without warning. Arguments often ended in blood. But over time, something unexpected happened. Dostoevsky began listening, really listening. Late at night inside dim prison barracks, while snowstorms battered the walls outside, the prisoners spoke quietly about their lives. One missed his wife. Another dreamed of returning home to his village. Some cried silently while pretending not to. Beneath the violence and roughness, Dostoevsky discovered something deeply human. Pain, loneliness, the desperate need to be understood. Years earlier, he had imagined evil as something clear and simple. Now he realized the human soul was far more complicated. Even the cruelest men carried hidden wounds. And even the most broken people still longed for love, dignity, and meaning. The prison camp itself was merciless. The prisoners performed exhausting labor in freezing temperatures while guards watched constantly with rifles slung over their shoulders. Food was scarce. Disease spread easily. Privacy disappeared completely. And yet strangely, within that suffering, Dostoevsky experienced a kind of spiritual awakening. For years, he had drifted away from religion. But inside Siberia, surrounded by misery and death, faith slowly returned to him, not as blind certainty, but as fragile hope. He began reading the New Testament obsessively, often late into the night while the others slept nearby. The stories felt different now, more real, more painful, more human. And gradually a new idea took shape inside him. Perhaps suffering itself could transform people. Perhaps pain was not merely something to escape, but something capable of revealing the deepest truths about existence. This belief would later echo through all of his greatest novels. Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, Notes from Underground. Again and again, his characters would suffer, collapse, and struggle toward redemption just as he had. By the time Dostoevsky finally left Siberia years later, he was no longer the idealistic young intellectual arrested in St. Petersburg. Prison had stripped something away from him, but it had also given him something, a terrifying understanding of human nature, its darkness, its contradictions, and its strange hunger for meaning, even in the middle of suffering. The frozen prisons of Siberia had become his true university, and from their silence, one of history's greatest writers was finally beginning to emerge. When Dostoevsky finally returned from Siberia, Russia no longer felt like the country he once knew. Or perhaps he was the one who had changed. The years in prison had carved deep lines into his mind. He moved through the streets of St. Petersburg like a man carrying invisible weight upon his shoulders. The city itself seemed colder now, its narrow alleys filled with fog, poverty, and exhausted faces illuminated by weak gas lamps trembling in the darkness. Dostoevsky had survived prison, but survival came at a cost. He struggled constantly with debt, with illness, with gambling addiction. At times, he lost almost everything at roulette tables across Europe, chasing impossible luck through smoke-filled casinos while anxiety slowly consumed him. And yet, through all the chaos of his life, the stories inside him continued growing. The suffering he witnessed in Siberia, the fear of execution, the loneliness, the guilt, the desperate search for meaning. All of it slowly transformed into literature, and in 1866, Dostoevsky began writing the novel that would make him immortal. Crime and Punishment. The story followed a young student named Raskolnikov, who murders an old pawnbroker believing himself intellectually superior to ordinary morality. At first, the crime appears logical, calculated, almost philosophical. But afterward, something far worse begins. Guilt, paranoia, isolation, the slow collapse of the human soul beneath the unbearable weight of conscience. As Dostoevsky wrote, the boundaries between himself and his characters often seemed to disappear. Raskolnikov's torment mirrored his own inner struggles, the fear, the pride, the longing for redemption. Night after night, Dostoevsky wrote feverishly beneath candlelight while creditors demanded money and deadlines closed around him like tightening walls. Sometimes he dictated entire sections at terrifying speed to his young stenographer, Anna Snitkina, a calm and intelligent woman who quietly became the center of his chaotic world. Later, she would become his wife, and perhaps for the first time in many years, his life began to soften. But even as success finally arrived, Dostoevsky's mind remained drawn toward humanity's darkest questions. Why do people destroy themselves? Why do we hurt each other? Can suffering purify the soul, or merely break it? His novels did not offer simple answers. Instead, they descended fearlessly into the contradictions of human existence. Faith and doubt, love and cruelty, freedom and despair. Again and again, his characters searched for meaning in a world filled with pain. And strangely, millions of readers saw themselves reflected there. The lonely, the anxious, the guilty, the spiritually exhausted. Dostoevsky understood something few writers ever truly grasped, that human beings are rarely logical creatures. We sabotage ourselves. We long for freedom while fearing it. We search endlessly for happiness, yet often drift towards suffering instead. As the years passed, his fame spread across Russia and beyond. Young writers and philosophers became obsessed with his work. Nietzsche admired him deeply. Freud studied his psychology. Existentialist thinkers would later build entire philosophies upon the emotional landscapes he created. But beneath the growing fame remained the same haunted man who once stood trembling before a firing squad in the snow. A man who had looked directly into death and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what it truly means to be human. And perhaps that is why his stories still feel alive today. Because beneath all the philosophy, all the darkness, and all the suffering, Dostoevsky never stopped believing that even broken souls could still search for light. And so, as the candles burn low and the cold streets of old Russia slowly fade into darkness, we leave Fyodor Dostoevsky where he spent much of his life, between suffering and hope. He began as a frightened, sensitive boy staring out at snowy Moscow streets, haunted by illness, death, and the cruelty of the world around him. Then came the prison cell, the mock execution, the frozen silence of Siberia, moments that shattered the person he once was, and transformed him into something else entirely. Not merely a writer, but an explorer of the human soul. Unlike many philosophers who searched for truth through abstract theories, Dostoevsky searched through pain itself, through guilt, loneliness, faith, despair, and the strange contradictions hidden inside every human heart. His stories remind us that people are rarely simple creatures. Inside even the calmest person lives fear. Inside even the strongest person lives doubt. And inside even the most broken soul, there often remains a quiet desire for meaning. That may be why his work still feels so powerful today, because modern life, despite all its technology and noise, still leaves many people asking the same questions that haunted Dostoevsky long ago. Why do we suffer? Can people truly change? What gives life meaning in a world filled with uncertainty? And perhaps most importantly, can light still exist inside darkness? Dostoevsky never offered easy answers, but maybe that was never the point. Maybe the point was simply to look honestly into the depths of human existence and continue searching anyway, even after fear, even after failure, even after despair. Tonight, his story drifts quietly into history once more. The snow falls softly over St. Petersburg. The prison camps fade into silence. And somewhere beneath candlelight, an old writer still turns pages deep into the night, trying to understand the mystery of being human. If this journey helped you relax, reflect, or slowly drift towards sleep, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more quiet explorations into philosophy, history, and the lives of extraordinary thinkers. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which philosopher, writer, or historical figure should we wander through next? Now, rest your mind, let the world grow quiet, and sleep well.